Would you let Jeffrey Epstein watch your kids? Didn't think so. What about his accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell? Hard pass. So why trust him? Mark Carney, Maxwell's friend, not yours.
Good day. Welcome to the Cory Morgan Show. I bet you're all pumped. It's French debate night, right? You got the popcorn set aside and your time all set up to watch that and take part, or not. I don't know. It's just hard to tell what the value of debates may or may not be in an election. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. I think part of the problem is that there's too many candidates, so it's hard to get a good one-on-one between the real top contenders. Though we have one less now that the Greens have been kicked out. I'll talk about that a little more in a little bit. Got a good show lined up. Somebody different to see. Jordan checking in, by the way. The show's live, so yes, use that comment scroll. Chat with me. Send me questions, comments. I appreciate them. Just keep things civil. You can also discuss things with each other. And as he mentioned, yes, I've got Tristan Hopper coming on. He recently wrote and released a book called Don't Be Canada: How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. And if you're familiar with Tristan Hopper, he's got some, he's a great presence on X with a lot of his comments. And of course, his columns of the National Post are fantastic. Very sharply critical on a lot of things. So he's compiled it all into one fantastic book. And we're going to discuss that book. It's an interesting time during the election for all of this to come up. What I want to ask him, though, it sounds like a lot of the things he brought up throughout the book, which were fantastic, aren't really turning into issues in this election, or not nearly as much as we would hope they should. So we will have a chat about that. And I don't have Dave in today. He's out doing more important stuff. And most of our reporters and news crews are all over the country doing election coverage. So I'll give you guys the news update after I give you my opening rant. So what I want to talk about election-wise then, if nothing else, President Trump taught Canadians that there's no such thing as a foregone conclusion, at least not when it comes to polls. I mean, only a few short months ago, the Liberals, they appeared to be in an impossible spot. They were like 17% in the polls. They were down to the bottom. Even with the replacement of Trudeau, nobody thought the party could recover by the next election. Well, that all changed after Trump was inaugurated, didn't it? Riding on the tumultuous actions of Trump, the Liberals haven't just recovered their support numbers, they've taken a solid lead in the polls. And Trump, because he provided them the only gift that could save them, he gave them an external threat to the nation. When a nation goes to war, whether kinetic or economic, the first instinct of people is to rally around the existing leadership. Internal differences get set aside while the immediate threat is dealt with. Now, the Liberals have jumped on this opportunity masterfully as Carney strategically switches between being an acting prime minister and being a political candidate throughout the campaign. Meanwhile, Poilievre's Conservatives have been in a tailspin and they're struggling to find political oxygen. In the last couple of weeks, the Trump factor weakened a little. Trump backed off on some of his tariff threats and stopped with the taunting 51st state jabs he was making all the time. And it actually allowed other issues to hit the news headlines. And for the first time since the campaign began, lo and behold, the Conservatives have seen some upward movement in the polls. You see, when Trump isn't dominating every broadcast, Canadians pay attention to domestic issues, and then it benefits the Conservatives. When the news cycle returns to normal issues, local issues, Canadians are reminded why 4 out of 5 of them wanted to get rid of the Liberal government not so long ago. The cost of living is still challenging, housing is still hard to find and priced out of reach for many Canadians, if not most. Immigration levels are still out of control. Crime levels make Canadians feel unsafe on the streets, and the opioid addiction crisis is killing thousands. Carney's Liberals desperately want Canadians to forget about all that. And as long as Trump keeps poking at the hornet's nest, people will. Foreign interference, that fell by the wayside. Liberal efforts to drag all the investigations over the years, drag them out, appears to have paid off because Canadians have collective ADHD. Their attention span's limited. They stop paying attention at what the Liberals had done because Trump had dominated everything else. I mean, we had evidence of the Communist Party of China's support of Carney come out And some Liberal candidate issues have erupted, but it doesn't seem to have impacted voting intentions. Canadians aren't paying attention to the issues. At least they aren't for now. If they could just go a week or two without being distracted by Trump's actions, they might remember these things. The Liberal lead isn't a solid one. When the polls swing wildly in one direction, they can swing back just as quickly. The electorate is volatile, that we can see, and their support remains fluid. The Liberals know this, and they don't feel too secure with their lead. And it shows with their recent actions. I mean, having staffers try and disrupt and create a scandal at a Conservative event with buttons. I mean, come on, that was pathetic and weak. But that's what the Liberals just tried. The abortion card, they recently played that as well. They usually save that for the final week of the campaign. The Liberals aren't acting like a party confident it's going to win. If Canadians can take some time to think about the issues and the records of the parties, they will drift back to the Conservatives. Polls have consistently indicated Canadians want to vote for change in this election. Yet, due to the bizarre Trump factor in the campaign, Canadians in the same poll will say they want change, but they support the Liberals. It doesn't make sense. The Liberals can't campaign on their record, nor do they want to focus much on the current issues. The trade war and Trump are their biggest campaign assets, and they want to keep the focus there. If polls continue to show softening support for the Liberals, rest assured, the Liberals won't wait any longer for Trump to stir the pot. They'll pull a stunt and try to strategically provoke him. Unfortunately, Trump's pretty reactive, and he might play the part for them. How Trump acts in the next couple of weeks, whether provoked or not, is likely going to determine the outcome of our election. It's a weird place we're in right now, guys, when the President of the United States holds the fate of the Canadian election in his hands, those little orange hands, yet here we are. So let's just hope Trump can do something counterintuitive to himself and to his own nature and just leave Canada alone for a couple of weeks. Just give us a couple of weeks, let people watch, make their decision informed on the issues and not whatever haywire things President Trump wants to get going on. And I suspect we might see finally a change from the Liberals. It's frustrating, though, isn't it? You know, this is our election. And whether we like it or not, it's an outside influence that's really determining it. That's not a good place to be. And it's really benefiting the Liberals. I mean, whether you like or hate the Liberals, and most of the people in this audience I know aren't big Liberal fans, but they've got smart strategists among them. I mean, look how they play it. Carney is a dull, weak candidate. Well, whenever things look dull and weak, suddenly, even if they'll come, we need this in emergency, I got to have a cabinet meeting. I'll cancel my events, and now I'm going to be prime minister for a little while. And the legacy media will chase along and treat him as the prime minister. Meanwhile, Pierre Poilievre is off doing conferences. He's not getting ink. He's not getting airtime, not from the legacy media outlets. And then he can switch back because, you know, it's supposed to be a caretaker government during a campaign. The prime minister isn't supposed to be doing prime ministerial things unless he has to. But they can claim this crisis as a way to keep back and forth. And it's working. But we'll see. We'll see if Trump can just, just stick to bug Greenland for a couple of weeks, leave us alone for a little bit. And maybe we'll get an informed vote. It shouldn't be based on what somebody outside of the country is doing. Yet again, as I said, that's where we are. Let's see what else we've got. So speaking of Carney, and again, something we should be looking at is his wishy-washiness on pipelines. Like, it's one of those indications he will say whatever it takes to be said to win. Simple as that. Nothing new in politics, but it's just so blatant with the Liberals right now. But his past writings, his past behavior, his counseling of the Liberals, he's a net zero fanatic. He's as ideological as Justin Trudeau was. So he knows that Canadians want to see economic security. Canadians, for the first time, even Quebec, support a pipeline getting to the coasts. So he said, oh, yeah, I support that. But when he's really cornered and pushed on it, he waffles. He's, it's not necessarily a top priority. Well, what do you mean? It's either a priority or it isn't. And these are the things he needs to be cornered and questioned on. Now, we've got the debate coming tonight. So, yes, part of the problems we've had the Canadian debates, and it's difficult to overcome because we want to be democratic. We've got a pizza parliament. We got all these different parties that have seats in there. It led to having 5 people at debates typically. Now, the Greens just got kicked out, and I'll explain why. But it's hard when you've got realistically only 2 contenders for the top job, but 5 voices eating up all the oxygen during the debate. And people just end up tuning it out as they all shout and push around and so on. Even with a one-on-one debate, it can get bizarre or odd or non-productive. But when you got 5 voices shouting, it really doesn't get anywhere. Now there's only going to be 4. The bar they set for entering the debates, And it's funny, they make an exception to make sure that the Bloc will always be able to get in. So you have to meet 2 out of 3 criteria, one of which all 5 had was, do you have a seat or not in the House of Commons? Yeah, okay, the Greens, the NDP, the Bloc, the Conservatives, the Liberals all have seats. That one's down. Do you have 5% of the support across the country? 5 or 4, I think it was. And if you've got one of those 2, the Bloc has that as well. Then you qualify. The third one, though, is, are you running seats all the way, or running candidates, over 90% of the seats, I believe it is. Now, you see, that's where they make the third qualifier to make sure the Bloc can still get in, because they only run in Quebec. Simple as that. So they only need 2 out of 3. The Greens recently just dumped 15 candidates, and they did it for strategic reasons. They did it in ridings where the Conservatives were close. It was their way of saying, we're going to dump the race in favor of other parties in hopes that the Liberal or the NDP will win that seat, not the Conservatives. It's a tactic. It's not illegal, but it's pretty counterintuitive to democracy. Do you stand on your principles in running in every seat or not? That gave the debate commission a good, and I think solid reason to tell the Greens, you know what? You weren't in this election in good faith. We don't think your voice is going to contribute if you're going to play it that way. You're out of the debates. And that was just announced this morning. We're talking the morning of the debate in Quebec, and the Greens are out. So what do we got? We got the French debate tonight. And with the French debate going on, one of the things that's interesting in this is they're going to discuss immigration in tonight's debate. But in tomorrow night's debate, the English one, they won't be discussing immigration. They've released the media group that runs this. They've released the subjects they're going to be covering. That's one of the only reasons I kind of see to watch the French debate, or at least look at the headlines from it, because that's one of the things the politicians do when they're playing things. And again, the Liberals are bad for it, but all of them could do it. They'll say one thing when they're in this riding, and they'll say another when they're in another, and they just play the game all over the map. What did they say in the French debate when they're pandering to Quebec versus what are they going to say in the English debate? So you kind of got to pay attention to both. And it's interesting, though, that they will give them different questions on something that, I mean, it'd be one thing if it's a French debate with a question that's specific to Quebec that wouldn't apply so much in the English debate the next day. Okay, fine, that's fair enough. But immigration, that's a national issue. That's something worth discussing all the way across the country, yet they've decided not to touch that one tomorrow. Immigration is one of the ones where the Conservatives have a pretty strong point on it, though Poilievre hasn't been all that strong on saying he's going to reduce immigration to a manageable level. I mean, he's mentioned it, but he's been a little weak on that one too. There's the frustrations in these elections, though. I mean, everybody's worried about the gotcha games. They play in the mushy middle. You don't commit to too many things. The other thing tonight that's going to be different and difficult for Carney and the Liberals, though, is his French. Now, hey, my French is terrible. It's virtually non-existent. So I can't get on a high horse, but then I'm not running to be prime minister. And I'm certainly not trying to participate in a French debate. Carney, I could tell even from listening to him when he speaks in French, which is better French than mine, but that's a pretty low bar. You could tell his accent is very, very thick. His pronunciation of those French words is with that English intonation, which must be hard on the ears of a French-speaking listener. All the same, he'll do what he can. Now, in a debate circumstance, when you're highly stressed, when you're under pressure, and you're not fully bilingual, he's going to have a hell of a tough time in there. I mean, what Poilievre and, of course, Blanchet are going to do. They're going to speak fast. They're going to talk quickly. Like for example, I'm not half bad in translating somebody speaking Spanish if they speak, but they've got to talk slowly and they got to spell it out. If they speak quickly in Spanish, I'm lost. I don't have a chance. If Carney is dealing with the debaters and they're going to be speaking quickly in French, he's going to have a really tough time understanding what they get at. And if you want to talk about a tactic, that'll be a smart one. Speak quickly, use big words. It's just the nature of it. So it's going to be interesting to watch Mark Carney try and hold his own. And I think tonight that's most of what his goal is going to be in the debate. Just try not to mess things up. Seems solid. And it is important to the French voters. That's a big aspect with them. They want somebody who's going to comfortably communicate with them in French and, respects, they feel respects and takes their language rights seriously. So we'll see if Carney can come across that way tonight. That's going to be his his battle tonight, and it's going to be difficult in this. I couldn't imagine going into a debate trying to do it in his second language. Again, I've certainly got my leanings. I'm not hoping for Carney to do all that great, but all the same, it'll be interesting to watch and how they deal with that. All right, let's get on to our guest and into some issues, and that's Tristan Hopper, columnist with the National Post, as I said, and author of this book, Don't Be Canada, How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. Hey, thank you very much for joining us today, Tristan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Thank you for allowing me to shamelessly promote my book.
Hey, if you can't promote it, well, what's the point of writing it? But I mean, I read it. They sent it out quickly to me, and I appreciate that. And you really covered, a lot of the issues that, as I kind of said earlier in the show, though, the timing you would think for this book would be perfect, but most of these issues aren't coming up a heck of a lot in this election, or not in depth. It's kind of a frustrating turnabout this time around, isn't it?
Yeah, it's sort of a theme that came up when I was writing the book is, if you read the book, your sort of jaw is open or on the floor as you're reading about a lot of these things. And one of the problems we have is that most Canadians don't know that these things are happening, and, will often sort of refuse to accept that they're happening. So it's one thing, and every chapter in the book, I only wrote about a failure of Canada if we were uniquely bad at it. So there's not going to be a chapter on just, we had, bad climate policy, or we ran up too much debt, or we underspent on the military, because that's things a lot of other countries are doing, Western countries are doing. So I only gave it a chapter if we were doing something way more extreme than anybody else and experiencing consequences way more extreme than anybody else, measurably. But a lot of these issues, I think they got that bad. Because if you explain what is happening to Canadians, they just don't believe you, and you start to sound like a crazy person. So, in the lead up to writing this book, I would write a story for the National Post, and I would be called into a radio interview to discuss it, very much like this. And as I was explaining, what the law says and, what is now the rule in Canada, I realized I sounded like an absolute nutbag. And I think that is sort of one of our problems. I sympathize with the Conservatives maybe not hammering on these issues so much, because they probably have internal poll data showing that if you bring that up, people are not going to believe you, and they're going to think you're making it up.
Well, that's where we can almost, be thankful for social media in some ways to show the absurdity of things. I mean, all of these issues, as you said, for every developed country, they've been dealing with these things, like the chapter on the trans issues. Every country's sort of grappling with it. What's the degree of rights for trans people, and how much accommodation should we make? But we, as Canadians, just seem to have to go far and beyond, to the point of that shop teacher or Jessica Yanev out in the West Coast, where it gets unimaginable. Where, yes, somebody with giant fake breasts just has to take it to an extreme, or somebody demanding waxing of their testicles, and it makes it hard to discuss the issue with any seriousness, even though it's very, has some gravity.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a great example of a perennial mistake that Canada has made. Is you've got sort of an issue, you have to decide how you're going to address this issue, and Canada approaches it in a way in which we just have zero imagination for unintended consequences or bad actors. So there is no one in the room when you're saying, okay, well, how are we going to deal with transgender rights? And then they say, okay, we'll just do self-ID. That's sort of the lowest barrier. Anybody who says they're a different gender, they just sign a form, boom, done. No red tape on it. And there was no one in the room to say, do you have any, okay, I can just go into women's change rooms. I can go into women's prisons just by saying I'm a woman. Even if you have the best intentions, do you not understand how there are people who might exploit something like that? And that's something that comes up everywhere from medical assistants dying to bail policy. Canada pursues a policy. You look at it now knowing what happened, and you're like, well, this is obviously what was going to happen. These things were going to go off the rails immediately. And at the time, these are relatively uncontroversial. Whether it's before the Supreme Court, whether it's before the House of Commons, you have pieces of legislation that we now know were massively impactful. And no one's sort of speaking up about it. And I think it's because Canada traditionally has been a relatively well-run country. Just 10 years ago, most international headlines about Canada are, if you want a well-run immigration system, follow the Canadian model. If If you want to get yourself out of a sovereign debt crisis, do what Canada did in the 1990s. Canada is home to the world's richest middle class. Income mobility is more true in Canada than it is in the United States. So the American dream is actually a Canadian dream, if you think about it. None of those things are true anymore. But I think it led to, we are very complacent about our government. We trust our government. We assume there's no bad actors. We think we don't have to put checks in. We don't have to be suspicious. We don't have to worry about corruption. And that means when you get bad ideas hitting Canada, we had zero defenses about it. We just opened up the door, let it in, didn't even imagine they could go wrong. And that's why a lot of these bad ideas, they exist in other countries, but they're much harder and much more prevalent in Canada.
Yeah, and you began the book with the medical assistance in dying, and with some of the history of it, because that's an issue that's been going for a long, long time. I remember Sven Robinson and Sue Rodriguez. I had the opportunity to interview one of the lawyers who was representing Sue Rodriguez, and I asked, like, is this what you guys envisioned when you were, promoting the medical assistance back then? And he said, heavens no. I mean, we again wanted, the means for people who were terminally ill and in terrible suffering to be able to go out with dignity, but to extend it to the point of people with mental illness or poverty, they never imagined it would get that far. As you mentioned, though, it seems to be, and I know you were careful to try and stay nonpartisan in this, but there's a pattern. A lot of this really exploded in the last 10 years, and that was the beginning of the Trudeau government.
Yeah, I would say he accelerated it. So that's sort of, you're not going to see the name Trudeau very much. So, if you're looking for just, a book about how everything is Trudeau's fault in Canada, I see it more of a symptom. We created him rather than, he created us. Because basically every one of these problems was already germinating by the time Justin Trudeau came into office. And that includes medical assistance to dying. The Supreme Court case, which essentially legalized it and ordered the House of Commons to put in legal medical assistance to dying. That was prior to his election. So I guess what was interesting to me is all of these issues existed in some form and were already sort of working their way through the Canadian institutions. But if Justin Trudeau is guilty of anything, it's accelerating them very, very quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, Canadians have had the opportunity or multiple times over the course of that 10 years to change that if they wanted to in elections, and they didn't. So we've got to take some of the responsibility for this, which kind of comes to as well, especially when you talked about the opioid epidemic and some of that. We're also intransigent and stubborn, though, when it shows that some of these initiatives are failing. We just don't seem willing to admit an error and back off. It's more like an inclination to just keep doubling down and feeling that these ideological approaches are going to
you're a snowbird. You're only in Canada 6 months of the year. It's easy to just not think about these issues. One thing that comes up throughout the book is that issues that are identical and quite controversial in other countries, they happen in Canada and just nobody cares and nobody notices. So I often hear the criticism against the United States. They can just have mass shooting after mass shooting after mass shooting, and there's no fundamental change to access to firearms as a result. And we say, well, those heartless Americans, they would rather, just see these mass shootings as a necessary tithe rather than making common sense gun reforms. But you can make the identical argument against Canada just on the issue of a clearly broken bail system. Any number of tragedies caused by people who failed multiple interventions, repeatedly given parole, repeatedly given bail, have shown no inclination to follow the conditions of release or bail, just keep getting out, just keep harming more people, and then eventually they kill someone or kill a whole bunch of people. And what surprised me is there's any number of these issues that would have been massively controversial in, say, a normal country. There would be legislation named after it. You would have mass protests. The names of the victims in these cases, I'll mention one in Edmonton. This was a man who had a long history of random attacks and random violent attacks. So just, unprompted stabbing someone in the back, almost killing them. At a bus stop, and just repeatedly given release, token sentences, is given parole, violates the conditions of the parole, is given parole again, just multiple releases. It's something we're quite used to in Canada. And then eventually a mother is picking up her child outside an Edmonton school. He appears out of nowhere, stabs them randomly to death in full view of a surviving sister. Just as horrifying as you could possibly imagine it. Spring day, broad daylight, they're locking down the school. The school sees this through the windows, and just a mother and child randomly killed. You probably don't know the name of that mother and child. It wasn't a national news story. This was sort of, locally tragic. There was, one local vigil, but then it just kind of went away. I'm inclined to say that in a more normal country that was more engaged and more apt to engage with the problems of its country, that should have spurred more political action than nothing, which is what it did spur.
Yeah, well, there's a couple sacred cows you touched upon, and one that terrifies politicians that you did mention in that a bit. And that's with the bail and the release with the case in Ontario with the police officer who was murdered in cold blood. And that's the Gladue principles that get applied. Again, good intentions that have gone bad. They're trying to reduce the amount of Indigenous representation in prisons by giving bail practically whenever humanly possible. But it hasn't reduced the amount of Indigenous people in jail, and some very dangerous people have gotten loose. And unfortunately, it's led to the worst outcomes, but nobody wants to touch that when you kind of dip into the First Nations issues. And maybe it's time we started to find some courage to do so.
Even though, and then this is sort of what this came up in the chapter, it's quite surprising, the dissonance between the way Indigenous leaders talk about these issues and the way, white people talk about it on their behalf. You look at APTN, you look at sort of local Indigenous reporting, it is not particularly controversial that if someone is a dangerous individual and keeps victimizing people, that they have to be put away from society. So I've got multiple quotes in that chapter of, First Nations leaders saying, expressing, basically seeing it as a new form of colonialism in which, we have someone who has harmed our community. You caught a serial killer who targeted Indigenous women. He's eventually going to get bail. So we've got the tragedy of just having been preyed upon by a serial killer. And then you've got the double tragedy of the government telling us that this person is eventually going to be freed. And maybe they'll tell us when he's freed and when he's getting parole, but, sometimes they forget.
It is mentioned that it's disproportionately the Indigenous people are the victims as well. They're scared as well. They don't want to be victims of crime any more than anybody else does.
That's right. Yeah. If you're letting out someone who just has a penchant to find vulnerable people to hurt or kill them, yes, that victim is disproportionately going to be an Indigenous person and often an Indigenous woman. So it's weird. Another thing I mentioned is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report, tens of millions of dollars. And at no point in this report did they actually address who is killing them under what circumstances. Now, if they had, they would have found out it is exactly what we're talking about. People who have had multiple points of contact with the justice system, kept getting out until they eventually killed someone. Very preventable deaths. And instead, we just got a screed about how this is ongoing genocide. So just a great example of we are ignoring practical solutions that would help marginalized people in favor of, some high-level academic circle jerk with, massive consequences for people.
Absolutely. And then time went quick here. The final chapter you hit on, the other granddaddy of sacred cows, though, which is healthcare. And again, where we just, and I haven't heard healthcare come up at all, I think, in this election yet, even though it's always polls at one of the top concerns for people. Canada's system, when you look at it just by the measures of what we're getting for our value for dollar, is terrible, but nobody will dare question the system.
On sort of the biggest issue. So sort of the big, we could let it get as bad as we wanted, but we could always say, well, there's Americans dying because they don't have health insurance, so we're better than them. In the book, I've got it. If you look at the amount of Canadians who are dying because we have health insurance, but we can't access it because the wait lines are too bad. I haven't had a family doctor in years. All the free clinics are closed. Like, I'm absolutely screwed if I have a lump and I have to check it out. I don't know what to do, where to go. The number of Canadians we have in that situation who are dying every year per capita is about 10 times higher than the amount of Americans who are dying because they don't have health insurance. So if you're just talking about raw healthcare access, the Americans are completely kicking our ass, whatever you think about their system.
Yeah, the bottom line is whatever the cause might have been leading to a preventable death, you're dead. And we just want to avoid it. So getting on a high horse, if people are dying, waiting for care it's not acceptable. We should be examining that. But when you always, it's the squirrel defense, hey, look over there at them dying of this guy with the bankrupted because he couldn't get care. Well, okay, well, both are problems, but we need a frank discussion on it. So before I let you go, then where can people pick up a copy of this book and see your work in general?
I'm a reporter columnist for the National Post. We have a new podcast called Don't Be Canada. No, the book is called Don't Be Canada. The other one's called Canada Did What? That's actually a Canadian history podcast, slightly more uplifting than what we've been talking about. And the book is called Don't Be Canada, available at Indigo, Amazon, and I'm working on an audio book now. Apparently I have a lot of visually impaired fans, so, you don't have to read it if you just wait a few weeks.
Great. Well, and a lot of people like getting the book to hear in the drive. And this is the book here, guys, and it was a great read. I really did enjoy it. And as I said in my opening monologue, I'm kind of hoping the Trump factor goes aside and Canadians kind of just drill down into issues for a couple of weeks before they make their minds up in the election.
Trump couldn't hope to screw us nearly as hard as we screwed ourselves. That's the moral of the book.
Well, we can't blame it all on him. No, if we pay attention, then we really don't have an excuse. So you've really laid out the top issues people should be looking at and just kind of a good drill down, if a bit depressing when you read it, but it's a cold bucket of water we need as Canadians, I think. So I appreciate you writing it, and I look forward to seeing more of your columns in the Post.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So as I said, that was Tristan Hopper from the National Post, and it really is a good read. And as I said, on X too, he's a fantastic personality on there. He gets that opinion knife out and cuts without mercy on there. And the book was a good read, so check it out. Don't Be Canada. We're a sad, bad example of things, and I can imagine. I don't know the timelines, but I think a lot of this was written. I would guess, before everything kind of changed, right? It takes a while for things to get published and get to print and the whole works. So presumably maybe Trudeau was still in power at the time of that, or maybe he'd just gone out, but things have changed so dramatically. We can't forget all of these things: healthcare, crime, immigration, housing crisis. He covers that in this. And again, Canada has become a negative example for everything on these things, where we, self-styled genocidal country and this bizarre extremes we go to. I mean, he points in the book to a disabled veteran, trying to get help getting a chairlift. And Mike with Freedom Honey's been covering that too, as he's a veteran. The amount of veterans been pushed to medical assistance and dying. We've seen memes about it. We've seen that joke about it, where they talk about it. If somebody has an injury that they want treated, if they go to an American place, it's kind of like, how much do you want to spend, or it'll cost this much. And if you go to England, they say it'll take this long. And in Canada, you go and they say, have you considered death? And the numbers that Tristan covers in this book too, when you offer it, when you push it that much, there's an astounding amount of people who've been choosing medical assistance and dying. There was one person who chose it, and it kind of coupled in with the healthcare coverage that Tristan talks about in there, where he got bed sores so bad the bone was exposed. He was in terrible pain. This was a man with a lot of other issues. And rather than deal with months of terrible treatment and pain for it, he just said, you know what, I've had it, I'm done. And he chose medical assistance and dying. This was not a man in terminal condition. It was a man in bad condition. And then we're talking now that it expanded into people with mental health issues. Well, if you've got a mental health issue, are you not the worst person at that particular time to judge whether or not it's time to end your life? It's quite different than, say, if it's somebody, again, with a terminal disease that is, progressing and leaving them in misery, and there's just no way they're going to come out of it. And they'd like to perhaps end while they still have, some degree of function. And, fine, that's one thing. But now they've expanded and call it a right to everybody for the most trivial of reasons. Sometimes is not good, guys. And it's, aside from the tragedy, it's embarrassing. It's, as he said, don't be Canada. But we take everything and take it to the extreme. I don't know. We'll see. But honestly, search it out. Give it a read. Tristan's great out there. Let's see here. So let's get back to some of our polling. Some of the other interesting stuff. I was talking a little bit about the debate. And now polls are kind of fluid right now and things, right? So there's a poll and Post Media put out on support for Quebec sovereignty. Again, you see everybody kind of circles the wagons when you get the outside threat. So everybody got annoyed with Trump. They got pissed off. The support for sovereignty in Quebec had dropped to 30%, dropped to 30. Think about that. Since then, it's bounced back up to 36. Like, don't dismiss this. That's a significant amount of support for outright independence. People who aren't long enough in the tooth, I guess, to remember, but it was only 1% back in the 90s when they went to their referendum, and things can change fast. The sovereignty issue in Alberta is one that's growing too. We're looking at numbers now that rival Quebec's, and they're only going to grow. It's a funny balancing act that our leaders have to deal with right now. Premier Smith in Alberta is really pushing hard on the provincial autonomy front. She hasn't pushed for full-out separatism or sovereignty or anything of the sort, but she definitely is more regionalist and inclined that way. But that infuriates people in other parts of the country. And then when they get upset, then that can get dropped on Poilievre. There's a lot of guilt by association we're dumping on politicians all the time. I mean, Poilievre's never been sitting one-on-one with Trump or anything like that, or close friend, but just the fact that Trump's considered conservative, which again, if he tries governing by tariffs, I don't call him all that conservative, but whatever. Because people think, well, Trump's conservative, Poilievre's conservative, thus Poilievre must be like Trump, thus I won't support him. Like, it's nuts, it's stupid. They're different individuals altogether with different policy sets, but that's the way some of these things work. And then it comes to, well, Premier Smith likes Poilievre, and Smith has been flirting with independence-minded people, thus Poilievre must be doing so. And they play that game again and again. It's where it sounds like Premier Smith's going to try and be a little quiet on things, at least till the federal election's over, just so it's not dominating. Paradoxically saying the logic of a 3-year-old. Unfortunately, yes, but it seems a lot of our Central Canadian voters are lacking logic. Commenter James Metcher saying, Quebec will never leave. They like being on the gravy train. There's where I disagree. There's certainly some. There's politicians who take full advantage of being able to wag the Canadian dog, as a tail, by always threatening to go, and they constantly get pandered to. They constantly get, a disproportionate amount of attention, political power, transfer payments, money, everything. They're not going to say no to it. But don't say they'll never leave, because the secessionist movement there is real. It is real. And it's not like the Western one. We put our Western lens on Quebec independence-minded people, and it doesn't make sense to us. We say, well, they're a recipient of equalization, and they're coddled by the federal system, and they get extra contracts, and they get extra government work, and all of that. It would hurt them terribly economically if they left, and that's true. And you got to remember the Alberta, Saskatchewan independence movements, they're based mostly on looking at the economic aspect of it. But they're looking at it in the cultural and language. And I found this out because I thought otherwise too, until I was leading the Alberta Independence Party, and I met with some bloc members back then. And we discussed a lot of things. Gilles Duceppe was leading back then. And that's where I really got to see it first one-on-one, just coffee shop discussion, things like that, or back in those days, more often bar. But they want out. They don't care. They're willing to lose money to get out. They want their French state and nothing less. The true hardcore independence-minded people in Quebec. So the economic case doesn't hold the water with them as you think it might. And it's not a matter of them just constantly wanting handouts. The true hardcore ones out there, they want an independent Quebec no matter what. Whether they'll get there or not, I don't know. And there are opportunists with that. Now, an interesting question out of another commenter, Joe Mills, saying most of the province of Quebec is Indigenous or Crown land. Where are they going to get their boundaries? There's a discussion that Canada needs in general and overall and in a large way, because there's a lot of misinterpretation on the authority and scope of what the Indigenous lands are. They aren't sovereign nations. We got to cut that myth out. We got to quit calling it that. I mean, they're unique creations. They're through a treaty. It's through, lands that were set aside. They're governed by the Indian Act, which is legislation, but it's off to the side. When people say no province can separate without permission of the Indigenous, why? Where do you see that? Where's the clause that says we need their permission? Likewise with infrastructure projects. There's an obligation to consult, but there's nothing saying we have to have their permission. We should try. We should consult in good faith on any large move that's going to impact them like any other citizen. But they aren't sovereign countries, guys. Not even close. Not even close. I mean, we want to talk about sovereign nations. Let's talk about it. You should have your own full governance, your own income, tax your own people, pay your own bills, their dependencies. And it's not their own fault. That's a longer, bigger discussion. But we've allowed this myth to kind of come in and think that any province needs the permission from Indigenous nations. They aren't nations. They're cultural groups. They're bands. They're highly empowered municipalities, but they aren't nations. And Joe Mills saying they tried in the last referendum, Indigenous said, no, I think maybe what you're talking about is the Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accords. And that's when we're talking about constitutional reform. And that's where it starts getting ridiculous too. Yeah, because we can't reform our constitution without permission from a racial group. That's absurd and that's ridiculous. And again, it comes back to considering consultation to be consent. Two totally different words. Quit putting that in there. Circle back, some of the folks watching me on social media might know I've gotten myself into an interesting circumstance with the Siksika First Nation or reserve out west of Calgary, or East Calgary, I should say. And yeah, I shot that video. I talked about that before. I put it up on YouTube on my own channel, on Cory Morgan on YouTube. And yeah, those clowns sent out these ridiculous trespassing notices. And, they're threatening, trying to charge me $2,000 in fines for having done so. I'm going to fight it. It's not going to, it's going to take some time. And it might have to go through a couple of court levels. Who knows? But it gets back to, who the hell are you guys to tell me I can't travel on a provincial highway? Because that's what it was. I mean, are you going to start charging people for trespassing if they're driving on vacation and having to pass through a reserve? Did you know that you drive through the Stony Reserve when you go from Calgary to Banff? In fact, there is no way to drive from Calgary to Banff without crossing that reserve, whether it's the Highway 1 or 1A. So no, they can't stop people. Now, getting into back roads and certain communities and things, certainly you could set up trespassing things. But again, people thinking you were wrong, you trespassed. No, I didn't. It's not another country. It's not a border crossing, you guys. And we got to quit indulging that thought set. Plus, and that's, I'm going to be doing more videos, by the way. I'm going to have another one coming out this weekend on a different reserve because it's failing. It's not serving them. It's not working worth a crap. They're suffering. It's terrible. And it's this hybrid society we have now of a culture within a culture, within a not exactly a country, but not exactly a municipality. And what it's all has caused is an unholy mess. And it's caused a lot of social disruption. It's caused a lot of entitlement. It's caused these guys to think that they can charge a citizen for trespassing on a public highway. And I guess we will just have to lay that out through the courts. What a waste of time and energy. But you know what? It's time to take it on. It's time to take it head on. Let's define what this really is about then. And what it is about is a myth that these are nations. They were treaties. They were agreements with bands that were I mean, we're talking 150 years ago that were nomadic. I mean, to put the base definition on, it's nothing against the people. It's just where things were sitting. They were Neolithic. These weren't developed nations. They were signing an agreement with nation to nation. This was an agreement with existing peoples with a country. Sure, it was colonialism. And again, it was 150 years ago. Boundaries have changed since the beginning of mankind. And to sit here and pretend that we've got these nations within nations, it's been destructive. It's been stupid. And it's holding up development and progress for people in and outside of the Indigenous community. So yeah, it's really time to start discussing these things. Let's see. Speaking of some of the fun and joys, this was a neat one that somebody sent me a note on. And this is happening, again, when we're not paying close enough attention to our politicians, how badly we get burned. And this is on every level. This is one of the areas where Trump, I think, is getting things right, though maybe they're doing it clumsily, is Doge. Get in there and get those bureaucrats, because they're what's holding up a heck of a lot of good progress, and they're what's costing you a fortune. And it's at every level of government. In fact, you don't scrutinize your local government enough. And here's Calgary. We can't get on a high horse in Alberta and have claim we only elect good governments. We've elected a lot of terrible governments. Gondek's Calgary is awful. And there's an ad up for basically a DEI manager position. So if you want to apply for that, if you've got your degree in gender studies or whatever BS you need to get that, It pays as much as $190,000 a year, plus full benefits, plus pension. It's only 35 hours a week. They say that's what the standard is. The standard. Everybody else has to work 40 hours a week minimum. You work for a city government, 35. Plus, every third week you get the Friday off. Plus, you get weeks and weeks and weeks of paid vacation. Plus, you get the sick days on top of that. And a pension, again, that you couldn't even dream of. And what does this person do? They manage DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. They want to make sure they've hit enough quotas of, I don't know, one-legged people, black people, yellow people, gay people. It's stupid. I thought we were over this. I thought we were tired of this. I thought the backlash had come. We'd said enough of this DEI crap. Don't worry, guys. It's as entrenched in the universities and civic governments and provincial governments and federal governments as ever been. Get mad at your politicians. You should. But don't forget, it's those pointy-headed bureaucrats who are really taking it to you. Can anybody name the deputy minister of any of the ministries out there? Those are the ones that really hold the power, guys. They make more money than the minister usually. And they're the ones that put out these stupid jobs. All right, guys, the Western Standard is, you can get past the paywall for another week and some right till the end of the election. Get in there for free. See those comments and everything. Take out a subscription if you can. Anyways, though, I mean, come on, it's $10 a month. It keeps us rolling. We got reporters across the country before the election, during the election, after the election. It'll be very important. Independent media is important. Join us tonight for the Pipeline Friday. We're going to have another live show with me from 11 onward and covering a few more of those issues. Lots and lots to talk about. So thanks for joining me today, guys, and we will see you on the next one.